Welcome to Maxara. Tonight's case is classified as a rural multiple homicide. Status unresolved. The following account is compiled from Bavarian police records, 1922, newspaper archives including the Münchner Neueste Nachrichten, court documents, post-war reviews, and modern criminal profiling analysis conducted in 2007. What you're about to hear is not an explanation, it's a record. This is the case of Hinterkaifeck Murders. Chapter 1. Bavaria in 1922, a country on age. To understand Hinterkaifeck, we must understand Bavaria in 1922. Germany was unstable. The Weimar Republic was struggling under the weight of war, reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Inflation was already accelerating by 1923. It would become catastrophic hyperinflation. But in 1922, rural Bavaria still functioned largely as it had for generations. Small farming communities were insular, reputation mattered, church attendance mattered, family structure mattered. Hinterkaifeck was not simply remote geographically, it was socially isolated. The Gruber family's prior conviction for incest in 1915 was not a minor scandal. Court records confirm that Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria were prosecuted. He served time in prison. She received probation. In conservative Catholic Upper Bavaria, this would not have been forgotten. There are accounts from neighbors recorded in police statements that describe the family as strange, withdrawn, and not well regarded. Social isolation can create vulnerability, but it can also create resentment. We do not know which dynamic was stronger at Hinterkaifeck. What we do know is this. In late March 1922, Andreas Gruber repeatedly told neighbors about footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farm. Police transcripts confirm this detail. He also reported hearing movement in the attic. Today, the criminal behavior analysts would consider this detail significant, because in multiple modern homicide cases, offenders have engaged in pre-crime habitation, hiding within or near a property before committing violence. The newspaper from Munich found on the farm is another confirmed detail. The Grubers did not subscribe to that paper. It did not belong. These are not folklore editions. They are documented. And then there is this missing key. A small detail, but in rural Bavaria in 1922, locks were rarely complex. A missing key suggests access, planned access. Chapter 2. The Psychology of the Lure. One of the most debated aspects of this case is how 4 members of the family were killed in the barn without signs of mass struggle. The position of the bodies, according to the autopsy documentation, suggests sequential arrival. This implies that each victim entered the barn individually. Why would they do that? Criminal profiling studies conducted by German police trainees in 2007 concluded that the killer likely used a lure. Possibly an animal distress, possibly a stage noise, possibly a call for assistance. This indicates familiarity. The killer understood now how the family would respond. There is also something else deeply unsettling. The autopsy conducted by Dr. Johann Baptist Amula recorded that young Cäzilia showed signs of prolonged survival after the attack. Strands of her hair were found wrapped around her fingers. This suggests prolonged suffering in darkness beneath bodies. That detail is not legend, it is forensic record. The weapon, a mattock, was found on the property days later, concealed beneath floorboards. This implies the killer had time to hide evidence, time to move calmly, time to remain. Which leads us to one of the most psychologically disturbing elements of this case. The killer did not flee immediately. Chapter 3: Post-crime behavior, control and domination. Modern criminology places significant weight on post-crime behavior. After the murders, the livestock were fed, the chimney produced smoke, meals were consumed, bread was cut, the dog was tended. This behavior is not consistent with impulsive rage. It is consistent with territorial control. There are documented homicide cases in which offenders remain at the crime scenes to extend a feeling of dominance. It can be a psychological possession. It can be practical delay, ensuring decomposition complicates forensic clarity. Or it can be something simpler. The killer may have lived nearby and needed shelter. Some researchers have theorized that the offender may have been someone familiar with farm work, perhaps a former farmhand, soldier, or neighboring laborer. The Weimar period saw many demobilized soldiers returning from war, often traumatized and unemployed. Violence in post-war Germany was not rare, but this crime was not chaotic. It was methodical. The 2007 Bavarian Police Academy review reportedly narrowed suspicion towards someone in the local environment, though the specific name was not released publicly due to privacy laws. What investigators agreed upon was this: the offender likely knew the family, likely had knowledge of the property, likely understood that the discovery would be delayed. Chapter 4: The investigation and its failures. Inspector George Gruber of the Munich Criminal Police took charge of the investigation. At the time, Bavaria did not have the centralized forensic sophistication that modern investigators rely on. Rural crime scenes were often managed with limited resources, and preservation standards were inconsistent. By the time Gruber arrived at the Hinterkaifeck, the crime scene had already been compromised. Neighbors had entered the barn. They had moved the bodies. They had untied the family dog. Some reportedly walked through the house out of shock or curiosity. In 1922, this was not unusual. Rural communities did not treat crime scenes as sealed environments. The concept of contamination was not yet fully standardized. But in this case, it mattered. The autopsies were performed inside the barn itself. On April 5th by Dr. Johann Baptist Amula, the bodies were laid out in the same structure where they had been killed. There was no sterile environment, no laboratory transport. The victims' skulls were removed and sent to Munich for further forensic examination, a progressive step for the era. Those skulls were later lost during Allied bombings in World War II. With them, any possibility of modern re-examination vanished. No fingerprints were properly preserved. Blood pattern analysis, as we understand it today, did not exist. Time of death estimation was rudimentary. The investigation relied heavily on witness testimony. And witness testimony in small rural communities is complicated. Over 100 individuals were questioned: farmhands, traveling tradesmen, former soldiers, neighbors, family acquaintances. Suspicion quickly centered on Lorenz Schrittenbauer. He had a documented romantic involvement with Victoria Gabriel. There were disputes over financial support and paternity of young Joseph. Some reports indicate he believed Joseph may have been his son, though this was never legally confirmed. When Schlittenbauer entered the farmhouse after discovering the bodies, he reportedly unlocked the door from inside, suggesting familiarity with the layout. He also moved at least one body. To some observers, his behavior seemed composed, too composed. But composure is subjective. Grief manifests unpredictably. Interrogations produced no confession. Searches of his property yielded nothing. No physical evidence tied him to the mattock. No witness placed him at the scene during the murders. Under even the investigative standards of 1922, there was no insufficient proof. Other suspects emerged. A former farmhand dismissed months earlier, an itinerant worker seen in the area, a neighbor worked with a property dispute. Each theory dissolved under scrutiny. The case did not collapse dramatically, it faded. By late 1922, active leads had slowed. The brutality remained, but clarity did not. Chapter 5: Theories Across the Century. As the decades passed, Hinterkaifeck stopped being only a police case. It became something else, a cultural wound. In the years immediately following 1922, speculation filled Bavarian newspapers. Rural communities, already insular and suspicious of outsiders, searched for explanations that felt controllable. A robbery gone wrong, a jealous lover, a wandering laborer hardened by the First World War. But robbery never quite fit. Money was left behind. Valuables were untouched. The farm was not ransacked. Whoever committed the murders did not appear rushed. They appear methodical. Revenge became the next theory. Years earlier, Andreas and Victoria Gabriel had been convicted of incest, a scandal that isolated the families socially and religiously. It was moral exile. Some theorized that someone in the community sought punishment outside the courts. A private execution disguised as mystery. Yet revenge crimes tend to display emotional excess, overkill, rage, public display. The Hinterkaifeck murders, while brutal, were controlled. The victims were lured one by one into the barn. There were no signs of chaotic struggles spreading across rooms. The killer managed the environment that suggests patience and familiarity. Then there are the footsteps. Multiple family members reported hearing movement in the attic days before the murders. Andreas investigated and found nothing. But tools were moved. Footprints in the snow led from the forest to the house, with none clearly documented leading away. Modern criminologists often point to these details. This attic or the attic suggests surveillance, not a spontaneous act, but premeditation. Someone possibly living above them, listening, learning routines, working for isolation. The idea that the killer may have stayed in the house after the murders is perhaps the most disturbing element. The cattle were fed, the fireplace was used, meals were prepared, the infant was attended to, at least for a time. This was not a panic behavior, it was maintenance. That suggests either someone deeply comfortable on the property, or someone who believed they belonged there. Suspicion repeatedly circled back to Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He had previously courted Victoria. He may have believed Joseph was his biological son. He was among those who discovered the bodies, and reportedly entered the house alone before others followed. Some villagers later said his composure felt unusual, but suspicion is not evidence. Over the decades, additional suspects emerged. Traveling craftsman, a former soldier rumored to have suffered mental breakdown after the war, a neighboring farmer involved in land disputes, even theories of organized crime, each dissolved under scrutiny. In 2007, students at the Bavarian Police Academy re-examined the case using modern profiling techniques. They analyzed behavioral patterns, spatial logic, and historical documentation. They reportedly concluded that a specific suspect was overwhelmingly likely responsible, but the name was withheld, partly because the suspect's descendants were still alive, partly because, legally, the case could never be reopened with certainty, and so the investigation became something incomplete, not unsolved in spirit, but unsolved in record. Hinterkaifeck moved from a criminal inquiry into historical anomaly, a case where the absence of definitive proof preserved the mystery rather than solved it. What lingers is not just who did it, but how close that person may have been. Chapter 6: What Isolation Conceals. The farm at Hinterkaifeck no longer stands. It was demolished in 1923, just 1 year after the murders. Officially, the reason was practical. The property had become tainted. No one wished to live there. The land itself carried stigma. A memorial stone now marks the site, simple, unadorned. Visitors sometimes leave flowers, candles, notes. But if you stand there today, nothing feels dramatic. There's no towering ruin, no looming structure, only open field and bordering forest. The ordinariness is what unsettles people most, because the horror did not occur in a side alley or during wartime chaos. It happened in a farmhouse surrounded by quiet farmland. Isolation is often romanticized as peace, as safety, as retreat from danger. But isolation can also conceal. There were warning signs, unfamiliar footprints, a missing house key, strange noise overhead, a newspaper no one had ordered. Each dismissed, each rationalized. In rural communities of the early 20th century, self-reliance was cultural expectation. To call for help prematurely was weakness. To suspect too loudly was paranoia. So the family endured the unease, until unease became fatal. There is something psychologically profound about intrusion within a home. A home is not merely shelter. It is assumed control, boundaries, predictably. The Hinterkaifeck murders violate that assumption completely. If the killer did hide in the attic, he would have witnessed ordinary life, conversation, meals, arguments, routines. He would have known the rhythm of the household. He may have waited for the right moment, not just physically, but socially, when neighbors were distant, when weather masked sound. This transformed the crime from impulsive violence into something colder, deliberate proximity. And then there is the aftermath. Why stay? Why tend the animals? Why light fires? Why create the illusion of the continued life? One theory suggests practical necessity, delaying suspicion. Another proposes psychological attachment. Perhaps the killer felt possessive of the farm. Another darker interpretation suggests a need to extend control, to remain in the space fully claimed. When neighbors finally entered the property, nothing immediately felt catastrophic. The farm appeared operational. Normality masked atrocity. That is the enduring fear of Hinterkaifeck, not brutality alone. But how easily brutality can exist behind ordinary walls. There was no confession, no courtroom resolution, no definitive closing statement, only archived testimonies, newspaper fragments, lost cause, destroyed evidence, and a property erased from the landscape. What remains is the question of proximity. Was the killer an outsider who penetrated isolation? Or was isolation merely the illusion, and the threat had always been near? The footprints in the snow led towards the house. Documentation of tracks leaving remains uncertain, possibly obscured by later snowfall, possibly overlooked during contamination of the scene. But symbolically, that detail endures. Movement toward, silence afterward. The most unsettling explanation may not be supernatural, not elaborate conspiracy. It may be simpler. Someone familiar, someone patient, someone who knew that in a remote farmhouse in 1922 Bavaria, discovery would not be immediate. Isolation does not prevent violence. It can delay its revelation, and sometimes that delay is enough. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved, not because there were no suspects, but because certainty eroded, evidence was lost, time passed, memory blurred, and what survived is not a verdict, only a record. A farm once stood, 6 people died, and a quiet return as if nothing had happened. Let it breathe.